Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today I wanted to talk about a book that has been fairly recently released, and that is Lessons by Ian McEwan. And I did a weekly wrap-up recently where I mentioned this book and said I'd do a solo review of it, partly because I think there's a bit more to dig into, and also partly because I think I am kind of just curious about how this kind of connects with the rest of Ian McEwan's work. So I should say at the beginning, I have read, I think, all of Ian McEwan's books, his short story collections, his novels. I think there's a screenplay that I've not read, but everything else I believe I've read. And I really greatly enjoy his work. I find him a really clever and fascinating author. But I will say I've had a sort of a fairly mixed kind of set of feelings around some of his work. So there's a sort of middle portion of books by him which I just think are exquisite and are almost all 5 stars and are some of the finest work that I've read, and I just thoroughly enjoy them. So I'm talking here things like the typical ones like Atonement, but also On Chesil Beach, which is probably one of my favourite books of all time. Also Amsterdam, which I really greatly enjoyed. Saturday, which I think is really clever. So many others. But I don't know, I've personally struggled a little bit with recent Ian McEwan books, and so Lessons was one of those ones that a few people had pitched as being a return to form, which I was curious to see if it was the case. So I'm going to be talking about Lessons here, but just to kind of say from the beginning, I will at some point go into spoiler territory, but I will announce before that happens. I'll try to keep the rest incredibly vague, or not incredibly vague, but I'll try to not go into major plot points unless well, yeah, until I sort of mention it for the spoiler territory. So with that, with that in mind, let's get started. So Lessons as a book at first appears quite an intimidating one. It's about 450-500 pages thereabouts. It is written about one character sort of following his entire life, and it starts, well, and it deals with some territory that can at first appear quite tricky. So not only talking about political situations, but also there are discussions within the book of an abuse of power, and particularly how that sort of manifests itself in a relationship between an older woman and a younger man. And also just that we know that we're going to be dealing with quite a bit across the book, not only because Ian McEwan is often a fan of kind of going into some of these quite difficult topics anyhow. So I overall really enjoyed this book. I think there's a lot to really enjoy from it. I think it largely, when we're following Roland through his life, we sort of start off mostly with him as a young boy, but we do go into the current day and we start to see how his life changes quite dramatically, but is also shaped massively by political forces around him. So when he's a child, he is surrounded by and to some degree obsessed with some of the big historical and political things going on around him. For example, we have the threat of nuclear war, we have things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Suez Crisis, we have so many other things come up during his early years. And all of that is sort of, we kind of get that almost sort of typical book trope of he's a young, innocent child going through life while all of this big stuff is happening around him, and he's sort of trying to make sense of that. In the midst of it, we start with this very early scene of him, and this is right at the beginning of the book, so this is not a spoiler. Right at the beginning, we have him having a lesson with his piano teacher. And there's something quite menacing and sort of, there's something lurking underneath this. And as we go not that much further into the book, so again, not a spoiler, we learn that he and his piano teacher have some kind of relationship that sort of seems at first to be sort of, him maybe fancying her and there being a thing there. But actually, as we later kind of come on, we realize there's a bit more of a coercive relationship. And this is kind of our starting point to the book. This is sort of within the first maybe 50 pages. We have the introduction of this relationship. We start looking into some of the politics, and we know that much more is coming. However, we then start to kind of fast forward through bits of his life, and we find out that much has changed, but in many ways, he's also worried about not living up to his sort of quote unquote potential. He, we come to learn is a very gifted piano player in many ways, but actually never fully sort of proceeds with that as his sort of future life. And at first we're sort of given to think that that's maybe due to him wanting to, to pursue other things and just having other interests and sort of growing out of it. But we start to realize there's a sort of menacing undertow here that potentially it's also to do with this relationship with this woman, with his teacher. And I won't say more now because of spoilers, but I will come back to that a little bit later. But we basically start off with this sort of premise of what feel like very typical Ian McEwan tropes, let's say, of sort of a sexual relationship, particularly the sort of sexual maturity of a teenager. We have something around wider political forces and historical forces, and we also have quite complicated interpersonal relationships that often feel quite brutal. And that's where we then go to the next big phase of his life. So a few years later, and a few other historical crises later, we move into something else within the sort of Cold War kind of frame of historical events, and we're looking at Berlin, and we're particularly looking at the time of the wall, sort of just before the wall and a little bit of the sort of time after. And he's written before about Berlin and about this time in the book Black Dogs, which was a great book I really enjoyed. And this was sort of an interesting, almost greatest hits sort of part of bringing some of that Black Dog sort of feel into this, of really looking at, again, what was an incredibly complex historical time of Berlin, of, the sort of echoes of sort of what followed after World War II and this sort of Cold War era and everything that's going on within that. And he, at this point, is in a relationship with a woman who is a novelist and a writer, and he feels almost inferior. And we kind of get echoes again of this previous trope of him being this sort of pianist and being incredibly gifted, and now he's in the presence of a woman who's incredibly gifted in another artistic field, and he doesn't quite know how to keep up or compete, and he doesn't really have a frame of reference in some ways for what to do there either. And this relationship, as with pretty much any relationship between men and women in an Ian McEwan book, goes wrong. And we kind of have things sort of break up a little bit. And I won't say more again here, pre-spoilers, but we know that things are kind of complicated, but there's actually a little bit more appreciation for each other, perhaps, or respect for each other than you might otherwise expect. And then the sort of latter part of the book starts moving into different historical times, and we start looking at the modern day. So we start wrangling with Brexit and Trump and COVID to some degree. And all of these things, it feels quite weird to see now in an Ian McEwan book, because I've almost always associated him with sort of historical fiction, looking back at particular times. And actually, it's quite strange to be reading a McEwan that's about the current age, even though one of his most recent books, The Cockroach, I believe, was sort of really around Brexit and about political leaders, on which more later, because that's not one of my favourites of his. And I think this is maybe the weaker part of the book for me overall, partly because maybe for me as a reader it feels too immediate and it's still happening, we're still feeling the ramifications of that. It feels quite strange to have that in a book in quite this way. But also I think this is perhaps where, kind of like with The Cockroach, this is where I feel like there's almost too much of an Ian McEwan self-insert. I feel like at this point there's a reference to to his former partner, this author, being cancelled for saying things that were perceived as transphobic. We have this sort of longer ranty passage that's about Boris Johnson, the former British Prime Minister, and that also feels a bit of a self-insert. Like, I could maybe believe that the characters would say and think these things, but I also don't know what the purpose would have been to have a lengthy rant about it in the book. That feels very much like McEwan kind of saying, hey, look, I don't agree with these things. And that's great, that's fine. But I don't know, it messes with the narrative for me of sort of it took me out of this really being fiction to some degree and made it feel a bit more like Ian McEwan just had some points to make. And that's fine. Write an essay. That doesn't need to be coming out of the mouths of characters necessarily within the book, particularly because I think there's a more skillful way of doing it. I'm not saying that authors can never show political thoughts. Of course not. I think there's a skillful way of making the characters note it and see it happening without having to explicitly go on rants about Boris Johnson, right? That's the part that for me felt a bit weaker about this book, because so much of the lead up had been so sinister and so cleverly positioned, I thought. And then to have, and you know, particularly the passages talking about the Cold War era and everything else, there was something really well captured in that for me. Whereas I think here it was let down a little bit, because it sort of felt like Ian McEwan just had to kind of stick his oar in a bit. And I'm like, there are subtler ways of doing this. Anyway, that then takes us sort of roughly towards the end of the book. And so those sort of three, in some ways, major time zones, I mean, they're a bit blurry. There are some bits in between as well, but those feel like three major time slots and sort of periods within his life. And then overall, then we've had this sort of life of Roland throughout the book, and the title then sort of seems to come into meaning again, of sort of, it's not just the piano lessons that we have right at the beginning of the book and that are on the cover of the book, at least in the UK version, but actually the sort of wider lessons historically, politically, and all those other things that kind of tie together in this book, and what he's learned and what other characters have learned in the book. And he's not meant to be the most lovable main character. Roland is quite flawed in many ways, and Roland has many other issues and things that he does not do particularly well, but he does ultimately learn by the end of the book and is better for it. He's grown, and these lessons seem to have meant something to some degree. But on that note, I'm going to go into spoiler territory soon, so feel free to exit the video if you need to. I will just say, overall, I really enjoyed this. I do agree that this is a return to form for McEwan. And I realise that sounds really, you know, who am I to be like, yes, McEwan, well done on coming back. You know, I'm some sort of guy in his 30s, you know, who hasn't published a book, versus McEwan, you know, long-lasting career. But I will say, I think sort of as a reader, I've found some of the last few books from Ian McEwan have lost a little bit of the point of view that I think made some of his other books really effective. And I think this feels like part of that point of view is coming back, if we take out some of those self-inserts later that feel a little bit contrived to me. Anyway, I'm going to go into spoiler territory and be back in a sec. So, with the spoilers now in effect, it's worth noting that in this book, obviously I mentioned this relationship between Roland and his teacher. And at one point in the book, we get something that I thought was really well handled by McEwan here, which was the two of them meeting up again in sort of later life. So by this point, Roland is an older, he's a man, he's sort of had more of a life, he's had some kind of relationships, and he's a little bit more able to see actually what had happened in that former sort of relationship to some degree with his teacher. And she is incredibly apologetic. She starts off this conversation by basically saying, look, I know I caused you harm. I interfered in your life in ways that weren't okay. You know, I tried keeping you with me so that I could be selfish. I could, you know, so you wouldn't go off to this school, so you would stay with me and we could have some kind of thing. But also it was always kind of at her convenience, right? Whenever it felt like maybe she was worried about something else happening, she would, you know, move the set pieces behind the scenes to make things happen. And he, quite rightly, is incredibly angry at this point. And so we get this really passionate conversation between Roland and this teacher, where he lays into her and basically calls it out for what it is. He calls it abuse. He mentions that this should never have happened. He was, you know, he was a young boy. He was not really able to consent to this. And so therefore, this is abuse. This is an abusive, coercive relationship. And although she acknowledges that, he doesn't really think that she's gone far enough to realize it. He thinks that she's very much at the stage of, well, I've said sorry and we can't undo it, but trust me, I had good intentions, or I was doing this other thing. And he calls her out and he says, no, this is not at all what it was like. And actually, I think this is a really cleverly done bit of the book, because it's an inversion of the typical trope that we get, maybe, where it's an older man and a younger woman. And I was nervous at one point in this book that the way this whole situation would play out would be seen as, well, isn't he lucky, you know, this young man getting like this experience with this experienced older woman, you know, all the sort of fantasy element of that almost. And I'm really glad that the book sidestepped that and actually said, no, we're going to invert that he actually does call this out as abuse. He recognizes this is wrong. And so I think, as a result, that was very well handled. And that felt like good classic McEwan to me. And again, it's hard to... I feel bad judging McEwan by his former output. You know, I should try and take this book as much as possible as, you know, its own thing. It's just difficult not to sometimes when you've got kind of experience with the rest of their work. But I will say that that was really well handled. I think the breakdown of the relationship between Roland and his writer partner was also really cleverly done, because the breakdown felt actually quite legitimate to me. It felt like that's how that would end, and actually that whole thing exposed a lot of Roland's own insecurities and sort of oversights. There were lots of things where he didn't realize quite how bad he was being. He was incredibly selfish. He did various things, and actually that also was part of a process of him understanding a bit about what had happened with him and his piano teacher. And so we start to thread together all of these things with this very complicated person, and Roland therefore becomes a sort of symbol of you know, facing some of the difficult things in life that are also happening socio-politically, and coming out the other end trying to find out who he is. I will say, I think the 500 pages aspect was the intimidating thing for a lot of people, and I get that. I think this does read fairly quickly, and I think particularly, you know, there are passages where I think Ian McEwan is writing this almost breathless, sort of masterful way that you really do go through it. I think for other parts it maybe does slog a little bit, and there are some bits where, I don't know, maybe could have been tightened up. I think overall, though, this book feels like a return to form. And again, I realise that sounds like an incredibly patronising thing for me as a reader to be saying to an author who's obviously very good at his craft. But it does feel like the self-inserts were much, you know, lower in this book. And if we'd cut out those self-inserts towards the end of the book, I think I'd have felt even more warmly towards this book. So overall, it was a sort of 4-star read for me. But I think it was just a really enjoyable read, and great to see Ian McEwan again sort of dealing with big socio-political issues, because I think he does those quite well. But also maintaining this real tone to the book of, there's this sort of almost coldness sometimes in McEwan's books that I find really interesting, because it's written with this almost dismissive tone of, and then some things happened, but there's often a lot more going on under the surface, and that's what this book felt like to me. So really enjoyed reading it. Looking forward to what McEwan writes next, and hoping that we're kind of in a good period of McEwan again. I've been Bob the Booker, talking about this book. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.